The conclusion of the First Samnite War in 341 BCE brought no stability to the Roman alliance system. With the elimination of one threat, another arose, this time at the very gates of the city. The Latin League constituted an association of communities close to Rome in language and culture, tracing back to treaties of the 5th century. Theoretically, this was an alliance of equals. Practically, Rome had gradually assumed a hegemonic position. Military campaigns were conducted under Roman command. Spoils were distributed according to criteria favorable to Rome. Newly conquered territories became Roman colonies, not Latin ones. The Latins fought in Rome's wars against the Volsci, the Equi, the Etruscans, but the benefits disproportionately concentrated in the dominant city. The incorporation of Capua into the Roman sphere of influence without consultation with the League became the breaking point. In 340 BCE, a Latin embassy appeared before the Roman Senate with a radical proposal. This was not about partial concessions. What was required was a constitutional restructuring of the entire system. The demand was formulated clearly. One of the two consuls must be of Latin origin. Half of the Senate must consist of Latin senators. Not an alliance, therefore, but institutional merger. Tradition transmits the Roman response through the words of the consul Titus Manlius Torquatus. In the senatorial interpretation, this was not a proposal for union, but a demand for capitulation. Agreement would have meant the dilution of Roman sovereignty, the subordination of the city's institutions to the principle of parity with communities that Rome effectively considered subordinate. The Senate refused. The consequence was war. The most instructive aspect of the Latin crisis lies in the configuration of alliances. Rome, which had been at war with the Samnites just a year before, now concluded an operational agreement with the Samnites. The Samnites transformed from enemies into co-belligerents against the Latin League. The Latins, conversely, sought the support of the Campanians, the very Campanians whose request for protection had provoked the Samnite War. Capua, however, maintained its loyalty to Rome. The Sidicini and other minor communities sided with the Latins. The lesson is structural in character. Roman foreign policy was not guided by principles of ethnic or cultural affinity. Latins and Romans spoke mutually intelligible languages, worshipped the same gods, practiced similar rituals. This proximity did not prevent conflict. On the contrary, it intensified it. The stakes were not survival in the face of a foreign enemy, but control over a shared system of power. Rome preferred alliance with a recent enemy to subordination to close kinsmen. The logic was the logic of power, not of blood. The military complexity of the Latin War stemmed from the symmetry of forces. Latin armies were organized according to the same principles as Roman ones. Equipment was identical. Tactics were interchangeable. Commanders had often fought side by side in previous campaigns. In a confrontation between identical formations, advantage had to be sought elsewhere. Roman tradition located this advantage in discipline. One episode transmitted with particular emphasis illustrates this principle. During the campaign, the son of the consul Titus Manlius Torquatus, violating orders that forbade individual combats, accepted a challenge from a Latin horseman and killed him. He returned to camp with the enemy's armor, expecting praise. The consul, his father, ordered his execution. This episode, whether historical or a later elaboration of tradition, conveys a message suited to the demands of the situation. In a war against an enemy identical in material capabilities, the only achievable advantage was superiority in cohesion and obedience. An army in which individual warriors could act on personal initiative, however valorous, was an army vulnerable to disintegration. Roman discipline became, in this context, not an instrument of oppression, but a condition of collective survival. The decisive engagement occurred on the plain between Vesuvius and the sea in 340 BCE. Both Roman consuls, Titus Manlius Torquatus and Publius Decius Mus, were present with their forces. The sources describe a prolonged and indecisive battle. The wing under the command of Decius Mus came under mounting pressure. The line showed signs of giving way. At this moment, the sources introduce a ritual element. Decius Mus, having recognized the crisis on his sector, performed the rite of devotio. He consecrated himself together with the enemy forces to the gods of the underworld, Tellus and the Manes. He then charged on horseback into the Latin ranks and met his death. The rationalist interpretation of this episode emphasizes the psychological effect. For the Roman troops, the commander's sacrifice transformed the battle into a sacred cause. The gods had accepted the offering, victory was guaranteed. For the Latin troops, who shared the same religious universe, the event was equally significant. They had been consecrated to death by an enemy ritual. Whether this episode is historically accurate or represents a later elaboration of tradition, its structural meaning is clear. Rome was prepared to pay any price for victory. Latin resistance collapsed in the following years. Individual communities were defeated or surrendered separately. By 338 BCE, the war was concluded. The outcome of the Latin War transformed the political structure of central Italy. The Latin League was dissolved. It was not replaced by another federation, it simply ceased to exist as a political entity. Individual Latin communities were incorporated into the Roman system by various means. Some received full Roman citizenship, others obtained civitas sine suffragio, civil rights without political ones. Still others were reduced to the status of subordinate allies with individual treaties. The common principle was disintegration. The Latin communities could no longer act collectively. Each had bilateral relations with Rome, not with one another. The strategic consequence was decisive. By absorbing the Latin population, Rome acquired not merely territory, it acquired people. The Roman system of conscription extended to the newly integrated communities. Modern estimates suggest an approximate doubling of mobilization potential. Rome had secured its rear. The internal tensions that had threatened the cohesion of the lateral system were resolved, by force certainly, but resolved. The combined resources of Rome and Latium could now be directed outward. The Samnites, who had rendered assistance against the Latins, would soon discover that the alliance was tactical, not strategic. The rivalry for control of central and south Italy remained the principal question, and Rome now possessed significantly increased resources for its resolution.